Okay, so up next in our series of panel discussions, our Manitoba Business Matters panel. And if you haven't yet had an opportunity to check out manitobabusinessmatters.ca, I encourage you to do so. The Manitoba Chambers of Commerce has established an alliance of dedicated partners, all trusted experts in their fields, to contribute to the Manitoba Business Matters COVID-19 Resource Hub. We are highlighting areas of business operations that are likely to be impacted by the coronavirus pandemic and offer solutions and information to Manitoba businesses. And so on that site as well, you will see all of the various government programs that exist. If you're looking for information on how you can apply for them, all that information is sort of in a one-stop shop place that we have created here at the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce in partnership with an investment made by WD. Today's panel will be moderated by Alison Kirkland, the CEO of the Women's Enterprise Organization of Canada. And she will feature 3 of those partners. Alison was named the inaugural CEO of the Women's Enterprise Organization of Canada in September of 2019. A seasoned communication professional, Alison has been working with women entrepreneurs for close to 20 years and has worked directly with women entrepreneurs at various business stages and in urban and rural communities throughout Manitoba. As well, Alison is, of course, an active MCC board member. Alison, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Chuck, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and to guide this conversation. I'm also disappointed that I don't have the same logo wars going that you and Mariette had, so I'll prepare for that another time. So I'm really excited to be here and really looking forward to talking with our 3 panelists. And so I guess the road to recovery, and who would have thought that this time last year that the road was going to be quite as long and quite as winding as it has been. So I think I'll start with just an acknowledgement of the amazing work that Chuck and the team at the Manitoba Chambers has accomplished in the last year. And one of the initiatives, again, is the Manitoba Business Matters initiative. And as Chuck said, it's a really robust site with constantly and continually updated resources and experts. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity today to talk with 3 of those experts who are with us today and who are contributing their wisdom to the site. And so we have lots of questions that were prepared beforehand, and I'd like to sort of just jump into that because we have lots of ground to cover and only a short time. So I'm really excited to jump in first with Theo Heineman, who is the president and founder of One Life Workplace Safety Solutions and a woman entrepreneur. So of course, very near and dear to my heart. And her company has been the go-to expert for both rapid risk assessment and pandemic plans. And so, Theo, thank you, welcome. And I'm going to start questions with you. And the first one is how would a business assess the level of risk to their employees and customers as it relates to exposure to COVID?
Thank you, Alison. Thanks to the Manitoba Chamber for all you're doing and for having me here today. Yeah, that's a big topic. And so really when we look at the true risks so I try to be a practical person, a reasonable person. I personally don't buy into all the paranoia because it's not helpful. It actually makes people so afraid and then we can't think straight. So the real risk here is to vulnerable workers. I think, so you need to take a methodical approach to risk assessment. And just so you know, we've done a lot of work hands-on with the virus itself, with how to write colonies and things like that, where we've had 100 people that are testing positive. So I'm speaking to you from my experience. So number one, you have to take a methodical risk assessment, right? And so number one, who truly are the at-risk people, who are the elderly, who have the comorbidities or underlying health concerns. And then the next thing you're going to do is you have to assess all your work areas methodically, area by area. What are the tasks being involved in those areas? What are the shared pieces of equipment, tools, and surfaces? How many people are in those areas? And I think by now we've come to a better understanding of how this virus spreads. It's definitely spread more by air than it is by surfaces. And so that's the start. So I want to be careful that I don't go on too long with my answer. But so based on shared services, tasks, and equipment, then you have to make a plan to limit and mitigate those contacts.
Thanks, Theo. That's great, and I think I don't know, is any of us realized a year ago, or just more than a year ago, just how many things that were around that we were all touching, and just all the surfaces that were involved. And while you said it's still not necessarily surfaces that are the main distributor of the virus, it's still an interesting when you really reflect on just when you bring people together in sort of close circumstances. So sort of carrying on with that theme, I'd like to turn it over to our other guest, who is Scott Hepner, who is a partner at TDS Law, and he serves in the Winkler, Morden, and the Pembina Valley area. And as the pandemic has progressed, we've learned that there are a lot of legal considerations that we have to take into consideration. And so my first question, and some of these are more involved than others, but does an employer have to notify their workplace if one of their team has tested positive?
That's an excellent question. And before I touch on that, what I want to start with is laying a bit of a foundation, because you're right, there has been a lot of changes, and a lot of the questions today are going to be involving, testing, doctor's notes, illnesses, vaccinations. And so what we have is an intersection of a variety of areas of the law. And so it's both complicated and developing at the same time. Complicated because you have this intersection, workplace safety and health, privacy law, you even have the charter poking up at times, the human rights code. And then you have the developing areas of the law, which are changes that are ongoing. We've seen the Employment Standards Code be changed. We've seen even as late as this week, the government has been making new announcements regarding vaccine leave and paid sick leave. But also because the science itself is changing around COVID, and what we know about it in the vaccines is changing. And so while lawyers love to answer with, it depends, a lot of the times you're going to hear me say it's also circumstantial or it's unclear. And so we're trying to extrapolate how we think previously existing law is going to apply in this very brand new situation. Now, taking that and answering your actual question about whether or not we need to advise employees if there's been an exposure, I think we start from the proposition that employers have an obligation under the Workplace Safety and Health Act to provide a safe and healthy workplace so far as reasonably practicable. In my mind, that would necessarily include taking steps to protect employees who have been exposed to the virus in the workplace. And so I think it is appropriate to advise employees if they've been exposed. But there's a big asterisk or but next to this, which is what you're dealing with is ultimately personal health information, because you're dealing with someone who's been infected with the virus. And so while you might want to advise people whether they've been exposed, what you don't want to do is tell them who it was that's actually suffering from the virus, because then you're exposing their personal health information. Now, practically, I know that employees might be able to put two and two together, particularly if, it was person next to them who's now mysteriously not there, but it ought not be the employer who's disclosing that information. So certainly warn, take appropriate steps, but don't advise as to who was infected.
That's really interesting, and I wasn't going to ask this question next, but I think I'll just carry on with that theme a little bit. And now they're talking in today's paper, there was a comment about the vaccine passports, and so what are the recommendations and policies around employee vaccinations? Has law gone down that road, or I'm assuming it's gone down that road, and what can you tell us about that?
It has and it hasn't. Like vaccines are a really interesting area and policies, so much so that I would say properly the subject of its own panel discussion. And I say that in part because I am doing one next week just solely on vaccines, and as is my partner Keith Labossiere with TDS and my colleague Kristen Kersey. But the short answer is much of that in particular is unclear. And the reason being is we don't know, or we're learning more and more about COVID as we go, but our knowledge is increasing. Our knowledge of the vaccines, the efficacy rates, all of that is changing as we go. And so all of that impacts, whether or not a policy might be reasonable. The short answer, if I can summarize a whole presentation into a minute or two, is at this stage, a vaccine policy probably isn't a recommended approach just because the law is changing. We have to look towards past cases to see, what judges or arbitrators, adjudicators are going to look at. And a lot of situations where we've dealt with similar things in the past, it's been with respect to flus and flu vaccinations, where normally you have an efficacy rate that's much lower. And a lot of the whether a policy is reasonable will turn on the expert evidence. And so there's just so much that's unknown at this time. So that becomes a problem, as does availability of the vaccine, eligibility for the vaccine. I mean, now we're seeing everyone, far more people are being eligible for the vaccine, but availability still becomes an issue. So rather than imposing a mandatory vaccine policy, for example, employers might want to look at other ways to encourage vaccine participation, such as education, reducing barriers at getting vaccines, that kind of a thing. But there's a ton of considerations that go into all of these scenarios.
Right. So not an easy answer quite yet.
Definitely not an easy answer for that one.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it over now to Dustin Mansfield, who is a tax partner at BDO LLP, BDO Canada LLP. And he's going to bring insights from the CPA Manitoba perspective. And so we've got, the health and safety, we've got the legal perspective. There's also the financial perspective. And so there's some really interesting areas to dive into here. And over the years, I've worked with and read, I don't know how many business plans as it relates to risk analysis and risk planning. But can you talk a little bit about disaster plans and what changes are needed in the business community to, sort of best practices learned through the pandemic as it relates to disaster plans, and any recommendations you would give on that front?
Sure. No, thanks for that question. And I'm glad Scott said that it was the lawyers that had the "it depends" answer. I think it's always the joke that accountants have that one. So he took that one away as my response to this question. But no, I've had the pleasure of helping many clients through this, and also on the personal level through my role with the local golf course down here and stuff. And I think 14 months ago, if you had to ask somebody to put together a disaster plan, it probably wouldn't have had a 14-month pandemic in it, and how to manage in and out of waves. But I think we've seen a lot because of the waves. We've seen a lot of the activity in the way that our customers, or the customers, may act, the way that employees may handle certain situations, to where we have to sort of deal with those, right? To many businesses, as I heard earlier, have been in some form of lockdown for well over half of a year now, and so it's almost become the norm, right? It's the disaster plan part becomes the norm. But I think it's changed. What I've seen a lot in it is the understanding of what's a comfortable amount of cash to be sitting around in a rainy day. I remember earlier on in my career saying to a client once, you've done fairly well, you've got some cash built up, maybe it's time to make some early payments on your debt or pay it down. And maybe they were just way ahead of their time, but they said to me, it's easy to get financing when you can get it. It's not easy when you can't. And I think, in COVID, that has really proven true, right? There's obviously a little more rigor in terms of, what you have to be able to show in terms of future earnings and things like that to be able to get it. So I think it's maybe learning from what's happened in terms of a disaster plan can almost be also some opportunities in there, right? How can we switch to curbside quicker? How can we switch to the takeout and delivery? Or maybe those just become a regular part of our business because that's now the way the consumer operates. But to me, I think we've learned a lot over the last 14 months. We had no playbook before. I think disaster plans overall are probably going to be a lot more top of mind than they ever were, as I think wills and other things that came to light through the pandemic. So I think it's learning from what we've seen over the last 14 months and how it's specifically impacted your business that you operate in.
That's a really good point, and we just did a national survey of women entrepreneurs, and one of the things that they have commented was that there's been lots of resources available, some great things in place, but it's been really difficult for them to sort of assess, what is available to them and how they should access that. and what are some of the conditions associated with loans or whatever assistance was giving or was available to them. Can you just talk a little bit about how a small business should approach repayment plans? And as you said, it's easier to get money when you don't need it. But now that, business has changed and, some are in pretty dire circumstances, how should a business look at a repayment plan?
Sure, yeah. So I think there's been a few things out there in terms of even the programs themselves, right? Obviously, the Canada Emergency Benefit Account and its repayment terms, how that all works. There's been a lot of subsidies from a lot of areas, and even as a practitioner, that deals with numbers every day, it's a lot to handle on our end. We consistently see different situations where, I never thought of that, or I never saw that before. How does it apply? But I think what's important, and I think the CEBA loan, for example, would be one that would be on a lot of people's understanding of there's a forgivable piece at the end. How does that all work? We're kind of caught up in the middle of the pandemic right now, so maybe not thinking about what the end game looks like. But it's December 31st, 2022 for that one, right? So that seemed like a long time away, a year ago maybe, but it's now next year. And I think, as in any business, us included at our local golf course, even down here, right? It's steady communication with our lenders, right? To at the start, they're obviously understanding what we were doing, how we were handling things, how are we dealing with this, dealing with that, to have a path that it's not, phoning them up on December 15th and saying, oh yeah, I need to deal with, paying this balance down so that I can have the forgivable portion, or maybe you can't get the forgivable portion and you need to follow the portion of where it converts to a term loan. But I think it's taking advantage of, hopefully, as we've heard seen some of the optimism from vaccines and otherwise, that you kind of have to put some of those plans to the start, have a discussion with your lenders. Maybe it's looking at some cash flow projections and saying, what can we accomplish to make this happen before time? Because what I've seen in this a lot with some of the subsidy programs is they're all deadline driven. And the first few ones were definitely pushed back, where end of January, we had our first major deadline on it. We had a lot of people that came in January, and it is very hard to, you think of the lending institutions, if everybody comes to them in December, they're not going to be able to deal with everybody at once. And so I think if you can get in there early, talk to them, show them through your numbers what your thoughts are, get their expertise on what can be done. It's planning well in advance of when that time actually comes.
And I think that's an excellent point. It sort of loops back a little bit to what Perrin said, and it's being proactive, right, rather than reactive as much as possible. So, it's all good to, well and good to say, but sometimes if there is, and one of the things that we did here early in the early days was, it was an opportunity for businesses to step back and sort of reflect on their direction. So I'm going to turn it back to Scott just for a quick question, and it's regarding remote workers returning to the workplace. I don't know if you were or were online when Trevin was going over some of the data related to whether people want to come back to work or whether they want to stay working from home. But what happens when you have a work refusal due to safety concerns? And what is an employer's rights and obligations under those circumstances?
I'll just lead with it depends. These are interesting scenarios too, and I have dealt with these as early on as, I want to say, like a month or two into the pandemic already. I started to see this issue arise. But again, starting from the general proposition that the employer has an obligation to provide a safe and healthy workplace. In addition to that, you have the Human Rights Code, which sets out that employees shall not be subject to discrimination in their workplace. In COVID, you see these two rights kind of playing out from both ends, in the sense that you have employees who might still be at work who don't necessarily want to comply with public health recommendations and orders, who are perhaps exposing others to risk. And then you have employees who are off work and are now hesitant to come back, either because they see that in the workplace, or even if that isn't in existence in the workplace, they're just concerned about coming back to a more public forum than they've been existing in the last year. And so certainly I've seen employees refuse to come back, But the approach that you take with respect to any of these employees is going to turn very greatly on their particular circumstances and the circumstances of the workplace. And so this plays a little bit off of what Theo was saying as well. But you're going to have to look at the individual circumstances of the employee. You know, do they have underlying health concerns? Are they at particular risk? What is their position in the workplace? Are they front facing in the sense that they're out interacting with the public, or are they in a back room and they never see anyone? You want to look at your workplace as well. You know, are we in the healthcare field where we have sick people coming in all the time? Are we, you know, an online supplier? And so really no one comes in at all. So you're going to want to look at all of these circumstances and coming up with a game plan. It might be that you have to accommodate this particular individual because they have an underlying health concern, and so the Human Rights Code is triggered. It might be that they don't have a valid basis for refusing, in which case you might take a disciplinary approach. There is a wide variety of ways that you tackle this particular problem.
And that has been the challenge, right, throughout the pandemic, as there's always so many ways and so many options. And so this is a great segue into my next question for Theo, and it is, what are some of the things to do to get your facility disinfected, and you know, getting people back to work, and we all know it's not obviously a matter of just, you know, turning on the open for business sign and getting things up and running, but if a business is shut down as a result of a COVID outbreak, and we've heard of that for sure, what is the recommended way to clean and disinfect your premises, and the appropriate time frame when that should happen?
Well, we've dealt with a number of businesses that have been shut down because of actual COVID outbreaks. And I'd like to answer this question in terms that it would have the most valuable to everybody here. So when it comes to, I mean, obviously, you know, where there's a life cycle to the virus. It's not going to last on surfaces for days and days and days. That doesn't happen. But wherever, you know, if there's been an outbreak and you want to do a good cleaning process, I would really refer people to Health Canada's website. So there are lots of products out there that have all kinds of advertising on the packaging that you really have to read it to make sure that it truly is a disinfectant that would work against something like coronavirus. So what you need to be looking for, every disinfectant that's approved by Canada that would work will have a drug identification number, a DIN number. So you need to look for that. And then the other thing that I found that's interesting is, again, you have to read the label for safety's sake, right? So at the end of the day, we want our people to be safe and our businesses to be productive. But when you look at some of those products, you know, they're have cancer-causing agents in them, and so the fix could be worse than the actual problem, right? So you got to read labels as well. And if you're going to have people using whatever cleaners you're using, you must read the MSDS and make sure that your people are protected against the hazards of the chemicals that they're working with. And the other thing I would offer is that, you know, the plain old bleach solution might just be the safest, the easiest, and the cheapest, right? So you put a teaspoon of bleach into a cup of water and you've got a disinfectant that you don't have to worry quite so much about the health hazards. So that's my answer to that question.
And that's great. And I just noticed that Carolyn from the Chamber posted the link to the Health Canada website in the chat. So that's great. I'm going to stay with you, Theo, just for the next question. And you know, we've talked, as Scott mentioned, just sort of the, you know, all the underlying conditions and you know, having to take into account bringing people back to work. And we've all heard about the mental health issues that, you know, have affected folks, just the stress of the pandemic. And so this is a word or a phrase that I hadn't heard before, but how important is mental hygiene to control the pandemic of fear in the workplace? And so can you explain a little bit what that is and what, you know, why employers or business owners should take that into account?
Yes, well, Harvard, I mean, there's many studies on this, but Harvard did a study Tetris students playing Tetris for 3 days straight. At the end of 3 days, they actually were walking down the street, seeing their buildings looking as Tetris blocks and actually wondering if, gee, if I tip that building upside down, will it fit between those two buildings? And they were dreaming about Tetris. So what's my point? My point is when there is an extended period of concentration on a certain subject matter in the brain. So I have a background in neuroscience, which is another story for another day, but it tends to magnify the problem, right? So it actually blows up the problem to be bigger than it even really is in a person's mind. And I'm not saying that COVID isn't serious. It is serious. It's very serious to those people that have are older and have compromised immune systems. So people that are really glued to the news and every moment of the news, whether that news is factual or sensationalized or whatever it is, it tends to, the word is escaping me, but it gives a distorted perception of reality, right? And so regardless whether a person's perceptions are distorted or not, if they're in fear, if they're afraid, human beings, we shut down from the frontal lobe of our brain. And the frontal lobe of our brain is where our executive function lies. That's what makes us human. So our ability to analyze, to the ability to be creative, to solve problems, to dial down and regulate our emotions, to have foresight, intuition, like all those things that we really need to actually decipher what should we do for our children at home and what should we do for our job and what should we do as a leader, like what's the right thing to do. So in stress and panic, we go into more of an animalistic type of behavior. And so, you know, people would laugh earlier at people hoarding toilet paper. And I was saying, like, don't laugh. Like, those are just people that are afraid. They're scared, right? So in fear, we act like animals. We either run, fight, or hide. So findings in neuroscience are clear that we have a massive ability to be able to self-regulate our emotions and self-regulate our nervous system. So when the human being goes into stress, they also down-regulate their immune system. And if people want to fact check that, find out what you get when you get an organ transplant so that your body will accept the foreign organ. They will give you stress hormones, right? So this whole mental hygiene is really as important as physical hygiene. And it's very simple. It's getting out in nature. It's slowing down your high beta brainwaves down into more of a slower brainwave pattern, whatever does that for you. You know, connecting with family, eating well, taking your antioxidants, sleeping well, eating good food. Sugar down regulates the immune system. And I find it so sad, it's so troubling to me that we don't have a significant amount of effort spent on educating people on how they can upregulate their immune system. We have an immune system that, if we are healthy, will deal with this virus if we're healthy, period. So.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, and we've learned so much about ourselves, I think, this year, and just what ongoing stress does. And you think about all of the challenges that we've encountered. And
I just want to comment on that. You'll say, well, why are healthy people succumbing to COVID? Well, are they really healthy? Like, look what's happening in their stress and like in their sympathetic nervous system, right? So if you have a mother, a single mother, or even if they're married and 3 kids and homeschooling, wondering if they're going to lose their job, and you know, people are in so much stress. And now you could say, well, I'm a totally healthy female and I got coronavirus and I died or I got really sick, but I was a healthy person.
Well, and which is an interesting point when you hear about the athletes who are getting coronavirus, and when you would think that they're, you know, in top-notch physical shape for sure. But so certainly the mental aspect of it plays into this as well. I'm going to switch points just a little bit and go back to Dustin for a minute. And one of the questions I have here is asking what are some of the biggest mistakes that businesses have made in the past year? And I'm also going to flip that around and ask if you can say, what are some of the smartest things businesses have done? So sort of things to avoid and things to do, if you could give us that perspective.
Sure. Yeah. And when I was reading through, you know, some of the questions on this one and saw the word mistakes, it's a harsh one in COVID, right? I think everybody I know we did, early on, you didn't know what you were going with. So it's pretty hard to know whether you're making a good one or a mistake. It was really just an outcome. I think what I've seen maybe that hasn't gone as well for some businesses, one of them in these areas for sure was really getting an understanding and considering whether they did or didn't qualify for some of the subsidy programs, right? There was a lot of lead in at the start before the first deadlines came due, but some of those programs had significant benefits in subsidies that sort of gave a lot of comfort to certain activities, right? I know, if you're talking about reopening or things coming back open, and you're considering having to hire on employees again or making the decision to bring them back, things like the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy were ones that certainly helped you be able to take a little bit of the stress away, knowing that some financial support, the government was kind of coming to bat with you when you were doing that. So I think missing out on those, and that is a month-to-month thing, right? These periods are still going, right? So it's considering what might be there. And sometimes it applied in a lot of situations that individuals didn't think of, right? I think just in the name of the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, it applies to owned properties, right? But many just heard the name and said, well, I don't rent anything, I don't qualify, right? But it does apply in owned property situations. So that's probably been a big one that I've seen. Failure to maybe watch what's happened in the way that consumers have operated through the waves, right? And I think what I saw in our local community down here, I live in Boissevain, a small community, but it's, I saw the push to online presence early on, right? And that certainly helped them when things continued on into Christmas season, right? Failure to do that online presence earlier on in the year to have it ready when that, what would, for a lot of retail businesses, a significant portion of their sales happen in that 2-month window. And so it was one that if you missed out on that, I think it was a challenge. And another one probably, not always within their own control, but inventory management, right? I think it's one where, it's happened in the good and the bad. We've seen it in clients that have done very, very, very well, but now they can't get inventory, and that's not necessarily their fault. That's just the supply chain. But other ones where cash is an issue, managing that inventory when it's not maybe turning over as quickly can certainly cause a lot of financial strain. So those are probably some of the bigger say negative outcomes maybe you've seen. When thinking about the positive aspect, I think it is, leaning back into the one I said about the online presence. I've seen a lot more businesses with online presence as simple as through Facebook or otherwise, or curbside pickup, that they never had before. They were never be able to compete with the Amazons or the whoever's that have their online presence. Well, all of a sudden when Christmas came around, and I know we did in the local area here, you could go on, they would, maybe they were Facebook living a tour around the store. It's not the same, obviously, as going in and seeing it, but it was a way for us to get through and then to continue to compete in a manner that they never could before. So that's probably one of the positives, I think, and one that I think could last, right, in terms of something for them in the future, continuing down that path. And I think the other is maybe, it's made everybody gut check a little bit. I think the world was moving at an extremely fast pace prior to this, right? I mean, you could have seen it by the number of airplanes in the sky and the things people were doing and the advancements in which we were making decisions. Some of the positive is maybe that it has slowed things down a little bit, maybe too slow in some circumstances, but I think it's given a chance for, I think I saw in one of the earlier presentations about businesses talking about investing in their people, right? Maybe it's not hiring people, but it's focusing on the skills improvements. And I think that's probably very similar to our own personal situations. We had to look in the mirror a little bit, seeing what's happening and say, you know what, did I really need to do something every weekend of the year, or do I need to focus a little more on my family? The same kind of things are happening in business. And I think that over time, that's going to be a pretty positive result in developing that skilled trade that will help with some of the recovery from this as well.
Great points, great points. And it really was a time of reflection in the early days. And it's interesting too, I've talked to lots of people who did take the time to sort of step back and reflect, but also to found, I'm working from home, I'm not commuting, I'm at my desk, for me, it was the dining room table, but from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30, because I could just keep going and it was always there. And so it is trying to figure out some of that balance, and it certainly was inspiring just to see the support of local businesses that has really resonated during this time. So sort of switching back, I'm going to turn it back over to Scott for a minute. And just as, people are thinking about reopening, and we're not quite there yet. And we're still on the road to recovery. But as we're starting to think about bringing our staff back, how do you do that? Is there's, if you're probably going to say it depends, but is it seniority? What's the process of bringing your staff back and getting them re-engaged in the business?
It depends. I felt like I had to say that, but it truly does. So there's kind of two approaches. If you are in a unionized workforce, then the very easy answer is look at your collective agreement. There's going to be a well-defined process for calling folks back. For everybody else, it is a bit of a unique scenario. And so it's ultimately, in my view, I think it's going to be driven on need. And so, for example, if we have one department that's up and running before the other one, you're going to be recalling employees probably in that department more than anything else. So in terms of the recall process, I think employers in non-unionized environments are going to have a far greater degree of flexibility. You don't necessarily have to go just with seniority, but whereas a collective agreement will say you need to do A, B, C, D, I think for the non-unionized work environments, it's more going to be driven by demand and also the underlying concern that you ought not be recalling people on a discriminatory basis. So you have the Human Rights Code out there saying you can't discriminate against employees. So you probably shouldn't be recalling people on the basis of age. That's not necessarily the same thing as seniority. It's not necessarily the same thing as wages, but sometimes there's some intersection. Or you might not want to call people back on a particular protected characteristic. So you always want to be concerned about that. But ultimately, I think you'll have some flexibility to recall on the basis of business need. For some folks, I think that they end up just calling back on the basis of seniority anyways, because that becomes a principled or an easier way to do it, because then they can just say if someone does raise concerns over why they were or weren't called, then they have the basis to say, look, we just did it on the basis of seniority. And I know we're not unionized, but we just thought that was the cleanest way to do it. But that might not be workable or practical for every scenario. And so it's probably going to be driven by need.
Right. That sort of, speaking of that and sort of transitioning back to Theo for a second, and so are there requirements, or there are requirements for workplaces under the Workplace Safety and Health Act for the pandemic? Could you just talk a little bit about some of those as folks are coming back into the workplace? Can you talk about those requirements and what needs to be in place?
Well, like Scott said, I think probably the biggest requirement, and I'm not the lawyer, so I can't interpret the law, so Scott would be the one for that. But we have the general duty clause under duties of employers, which, as he already quoted, is the requirement to ensure a safe and healthy workplace, right? And what I do know is when push comes to shove, it's what 12 reasonable people would have done in the same circumstance. And so what's reasonable and practical? What are the guidelines, even if it's not written into, and Scott, please comment, but if it's not written into the act and regulations exactly, what are other reasonable people doing? But beyond that, clearly, we have to have policies and procedures in writing, right? So, your pandemic plans, for example, I mean, that is a requirement that every workplace does have a pandemic plan. You have to have means that you're identifying your hazards, you're communicating, and you're controlling those hazards. So whether it's COVID or anything else, we have to have a plan to train our workers and train supervisors, right? Supervisors are the employer's representative on the front line. So they have to, be understanding what the safe way of doing work is, make sure that they are communicating hazards to their workers. If there is a dangerous situation and the worker does want to exercise their right to refuse work where it's a credible risk, have that opportunity, then know how to deal with that, right? Know how to deal with work refusals. That would be an important thing. They have to be measuring to make sure whatever measures they put in place are actually working. So if they've implemented safe work procedures, are they actually working? And then you have to be enforcing those procedures. And that's just really the recipe for due diligence. Right, so it's identify the hazard, make sure you're controlling it, make sure you're training your people, making sure your control measures are working. And if you can document, that would be even better. And every workplace is different, right? So like Scott says, it depends. Every single workplace is different.
Is there somewhere you can go, and maybe this is a question for either you, Theo, or for you, Scott, where there might be a template for somebody to get started working with a, sort of a pandemic plan, or is, I can only imagine.
I'll answer that one. So we put all of our, early on, we put all of our everything we created, we made accessible for free on our website. And I think Carolyn has done a really great job of transferring a lot of those things over to the Manitoba Business Matters website. And if you don't see what you need there, reach out to us, because it is true. Like, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm the sole shareholder here at our business. And so I understand deeply, the deep angst that so many of the owners and leaders are going through. It's unprecedented, extraordinary times. So we'll do anything we can to support if people reach out.
That's great, and that's so generous. Scott, is there anything you'd like to add to those comments, or?
Yeah, sorry, I made two quick notes here as Theo was talking, things I want to touch on. The first is with respect to policies. Absolutely, you want to have these policies in place, whether it's dealing with recall or safety measures or whatever. You want to have clearly communicated rules to employees. And there's rules and laws about how you implement these policies and how you enforce these policies. They have to be reasonable, they have to be clear, they have to be communicated to the employees, they have to be given notice, advised if discipline can result. There's a whole bunch of things you need to be aware of there, but ultimately, you need to have the policy in place, and you need to ultimately enforce it, because without any consistent enforcement, it's a piece of paper and it's not worth much from that perspective. So certainly they should be in place. The second thing I wanted to flag, and this is going all the way back to my answer about recall. People who have heard me speak before, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, might recall that when we talked about layoffs, I exercised, or I put a big caution on the notion of layoffs, because if you're not in a unionized workplace, at the outset of the pandemic, I said, look, this could potentially be a constructive dismissal for everyone. And I think at the end of the day, employers were willing to undertake that risk and still laid off their employees. And to my knowledge, it wasn't really much of an issue. But very recently, I think it's within the last month in Ontario, the courts there have affirmed that if you do lay off employees, except in very limited circumstances, including whether or not they're in unionized environments, it is a constructive dismissal. And so while the ship may have sailed on that for a lot of employers, if businesses are still experiencing a downturn, the pandemic continues for a while, and employers are looking at imposing further or new layoffs, you really ought to be talking with legal counsel before you do it, because there are a large degree of associated risks along with that. And so I just wanted to flag that for everyone, because I suspected it before, and now we have confirmation now that a case has made its way through the courts that it really is risky to impose layoffs.
That's great insights, and thanks for adding to that comment. We're getting close to the end, but I do have a couple more questions. So this one is for Dustin, and many businesses are going to be reopening, and it's almost like opening again. It's almost like starting from scratch. What advice would you give them to plan for that and to pay for the reopening? What would you offer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think in anything, like I said earlier about some of the subsidy programs that are out there, specifically one like the emergency wage subsidy or SUVs, or the rehiring one that's coming in later on, those ones, obviously you have to pay wages to get them, right? So in some cases, maybe while you've been shut down, you haven't really had much to do with the program and understand what it is. But it's understanding what kind of support you have there. I know making the decision here back last March into April, when we were deciding to open up our local golf course, that entered in very quickly, right? Once we understood how the subsidy program worked, how that was, the decision to get employees out there when at least you're getting some help along the way to have them there was a big jumpstart to just lessening the load, right? And I think if you can understand at what points the the rates kick in, how it works, that kind of a thing. The more you can get educated on that piece, I think it helps specifically with something with reopening. Right. When it talks about, a grand reopening or something like that, I think I also heard, earlier that the way the economy is, that there's a lot of pent up demand. And so if there is a reopening, people in theory, and by the way that it sounds, will be ready to go out and be there. Right. And I think I've seen it here a lot of times as we've gone in and out of the waves. When that day is lifted, we all want to get out of our houses too. So, it's being there and making sure that you're, like I said, you've got some stability and you feel like you've got some comfort that, having a few employees on and the help with the wage subsidy and things like that will be there. But I think it's, obviously going to the center, like has been set up here on that website, and scouring through some of the other funding that's available. That's what'll give you the comfort, right? I think everybody is always looking for a little financial stability prior to doing something like that.
Yeah, I think financial stability is probably two important words from the last year. I just had one quick question come in on the Q&A. So this one is for Scott, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. But would constructive dismissal apply to employers when business have been required to shut down due to provincial restrictions?
I've never had to consider this question before, but my gut reaction is yes. Although at the same time, and I don't want to go too far afield, there might be a different approach you could take to it. So there's this notion of frustration of contract, which is a common law concept that basically says where there's intervening events that could not have been foreseen by either of the parties to the contract, so employer and employee, and it results in a situation where you can't render on the contract. So literally, you cannot work, I cannot pay you. Then you might be able to say the contract has been frustrated and everyone's released from their obligations. If the government were to mandate someone be shut down, I think that argument definitely comes into play. But this is, again, is one of those scenarios where no one really contemplated, constructive dismissal and frustration of contract have been around for forever and ever and ever. And so I don't think anyone, not that I've seen cases where they have notionally applied this yet to COVID, but if I was representing the employer, that would certainly be a position I was taking.
Right. Thanks. So many questions and so much deep dive that could go on in so many areas. And so I thank all of you for your wisdom and your insights. One of the things I'm just going to do a quick roundtable, and the same question for everyone. And Dustin, I'll start with you. Is what advice would you give to somebody as they're planning to reopen, or hoping things get back to normal? What one piece of advice would you give to a client?
Yeah, well, I think for anything, it's be optimistic, right? Not to the point of false suppose, but I think it's one where I've seen a lot of community support, in our region for sure. And I think, it's been a tough year. I think as Deo said earlier, I think I see everything as it's 6 feet apart, but it's one of those things where if you can get in the right mindset and trust what you've done before, that's why you're successful as an entrepreneur, right? That's what drives you and what makes you what you are. And I shouldn't change that because of a pandemic. If anything, it should make you stronger. The resilience I've seen. So I guess it's just optimism. Maybe it's a little bit of cautious optimism, but trust yourself.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. Scott, over to you. What would you say? What would advice would you give?
This is an interesting question. And I might be piggybacking on Dustin a little bit here with something he said before, in the sense that everyone's slowed down a bit a lot of the time. I actually have a lot of clients who sped up unforeseeably, like nobody expected that. So you have two extremes. But I would say use it as an opportunity to get your house in order. I think the pandemic for a lot of people exposed a lot of risks or things about their operation that maybe weren't operating as effectively as it could be. And so this isn't really legal advice, but it's perhaps more practical advice. But if there is a chance to take the breath and say, okay, we're restarting. What can we do to move forward that's going to make it even better than what we were doing before?
Wonderful. Thank you. Theo, last word to you.
Well, at the end of the day, our businesses will perform kind of congruent to how well our people can perform. And Scott made a really good point. In some organizations, there's a lot of stress because of the fear of the virus, or because they're unemployed or work is down. On the other hand, some of them are under stress because they're so busy. And I think there's a silver lining in everything. And I think we've been reminded that we are humans first, not doing beings. We're human beings. And my encouragement would be, if we've chosen to be a leader, then we have chosen to lead and take care of people. And I think one of the number one requirements is to really help people deal with their emotional mental health, because we know that has a massive impact on how that business performs. And Peter Sandman is a well-known safety dude, and typically the risk equation is risk equals hazard times probability, and he said risk is actually hazard plus outrage, meaning that if your people's emotions are running ragged, whether out of fear or frustration or anxiety or anything, they cannot perform, and it will kibosh your business. So we need to tune into our people, listen to them, take care of them, educate them, support them, and the businesses will do better accordingly.
Really strong messages from all of you, and thank you very much for sharing again your wisdom. I just want to close here by reminding folks about Manitoba Business Matters, and that was the whole idea of this panel, was to talk about the resources that exist at manitobabusinessmatters.ca. So sign up for the newsletter, follow them on social media, and get your copy of Business is Unusual, a coronavirus guide for Manitoba business. And I'd also just like to recognize as well the partners who have supported that, and it's the province of Manitoba, Western Economic Diversification Canada, Red River College Corporate Solutions, Bell MTS, Vantage, Chambers Plan Employee Benefits, and of course, the organizations that our panelists represent. So One Life Workplace Safety Solutions, Thompson Dorfman Sweatman LLP, and CPA Manitoba. So thanks again to all of you. It was great. And I think we could keep going all afternoon, but I see Chuck is here, so he's probably not going to allow that. So over to you, Chuck.
Again, thank you, Perrin.